Okay, it's my privilege to present Alenka Zupančič as the first speaker in the last session. I always my presentation of introduction to Alenka's speeches is always the same. I always say that everybody knows Alenka, so I don't have to introduce her. So, but I would still say some words. So Alenka Zupančič is a researcher at the Institute of Philosophy of the SAZU, and professor at EGS and postgraduate school SAZU. She's authored in numerous books. One of the one I still like the most, perhaps, is The Ethics of the Real. So it's kind of the book that it's kind of it's just I got smarter because of this book. So it's kind of I appreciate this book a lot because it was a book that very important for my philosophical formation. So I'm really grateful for Alenka for this book, and for Alenka, we should all be grateful that we have her at the Institute. Her last book, though, the one on Antigone, is really a good one as well. So, and every other book in her series of her careers, it's just, I fucked it up, sorry. But I just wanted to act nice, but I messed it up. So Alenka, please save me from my misery.
Yeah, thank you today. So I do my best to come up with Peter's line to fail worse with every book. So it's kind of. So okay, what I will present today is part of a unfortunately a bit longer text that I've written just recently. So it's very fresh, and it's also the problem is perhaps that I really also needed to shorten it for this occasion, so it's hopefully it will still make sense and not come across as too abstract or complicated. But here it goes. So as we all know and discuss this for the past couple of days, Lacan was not exactly a philosopher. He even called himself an anti-philosopher. Nevertheless, not only his knowledge of philosophy, but also his direct engagement with it was profound, comprehensive, and a constant in his work. This just never really changed. And the question of his complex relationship to philosophy is often kind of avoided by using the term theory and speaking of psychoanalytic or Lacanian theory. And my starting question is, what if the distinction between theory and philosophy overlooks something crucial in the relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy? What if the difference between the two can only be truly understood by focusing on their common ground? And what if this common ground has to do with the speculative? So this is the kind of general frame. So if theory relates to, clinical practice by way of establishing connections between particular cases, proposing generalizations and laws, there is something different at stake when it comes, I think, to these genuine psychoanalytic concepts. Of course, not every theoretical term or name is a concept in the strong sense of the term. For example, the term unconscious existed obviously before Freud, but it was only with Freud that it became a concept proper. Before Freud, but this lax usage continued to exist after Freud. It designated the non-conscious, the more or less conscious, something defined in contrast to consciousness. Or else, when thought about in more substantial terms, it designated, let's say, the messages sent from beyond or some obscure primordial will. The Freudian concept of the unconscious, on the other hand, is not defined in opposition to consciousness, in spite of this unfortunate prefix unbewusste, but as something rather homologous with what occurs at the level of the subject, something quite elaborate, quite as elaborate as what happens at the level of the consciousness, something that thinks and speaks. Moreover, it is a concept that affects and changes profoundly our ideas about the consciousness, since there is an interaction and properly dialectical, let's say, connection between the two levels. We cannot think one without thinking the other. Freud's invention of the unconscious as concept was also a revolution in the concept of the consciousness, which thus kind of loses what seemed to be its privilege. We could also say that it constitutes a revolution in the concept of the subject, a revolution carried out particularly by Lacan. But is concept of the unconscious a speculative concept? I would be tempted to call it so. It is speculative in at least two meanings of this word. First, and put in the simplest terms, in the sense that it does not refer to something we can see, measure, or establish in any direct, empirical way, but involves speculative conclusions based on observable things which interrupt the smooth or usual functioning of, let's say, conscious life, and appear as impediment, interruption, failure, stumbling, or surprising surplus occurrence, and so on. So this is also one sense of the speculative that we were slightly discussing yesterday. Second, it is also speculative in a sense that comes perhaps closer to the Hegelian meaning of the term, something different from more or less abstract reflection on this or that object or phenomenon, something that involves thinking the thing from within in its dynamics and life, and in connection to its supposed opposite precisely. Something that conceives substance also as subject. And I think it is in fact rather astounding how this last and most famous Hegelian phrasing of the speculative finds a kind of literal, almost too literal embodiment in the concept of the unconscious, something out there that speaks and thinks, involving a split subject that does not stand opposite the substance but constitutes its own negative core and induces its movement. But the point of my presentation today is not to demonstrate the compatibility or affinity between Hegel and Lacan, but actually something much more specific. I would like to take up and follow a thread of what I see as Lacan's speculative thinking in the case of his reading, or rather reiterating, of the Cartesian cogito. Lacan's frequent comments on the cogito argument and two elaborate, albeit considerably different readings he proposes of it speak to the quite central role of that what happened with Descartes plays in psychoanalysis and its concept, speculative concept, starting with the concept of the unconscious. Okay, so Descartes, you know very well, this is very, at the heart of the Cartesian procedure is a point at which methodical hyperbolic doubt in everything I know produces certainty of being. Part of methodical doubt is the hypothesis of an evil genius, a deceiving God, already mentioned previously, who can lead me astray about absolutely everything, including the most obvious rational truths. Following the path of methodical doubt, Descartes concludes that I can in fact doubt absolutely everything I know, even the things that I hold for the most obviously true, and that I must indeed doubt everything I know. At this precise and kind of vertiginous point, at which the certainty of what I know disappears completely, another kind of certainty appears, the certainty of being. Therefore, I am. Even if absolutely everything I know is false, a result of deception, illusion, I am still the subject of this false knowledge. I have these false thoughts, therefore I am. Okay, let's stop here for a moment. For I think we can legitimately question the continuity that is supposed to guide this process, the continuity that Descartes locates in knowledge. When doubt seizes all knowledge of things, of rational ideas and of ourselves, we are left with one and only certain knowledge, the knowledge of our being. But is this really knowledge? Is certainty knowledge? Are they of the same texture? Are certainty and knowledge one and the same thing? Is certainty the last and only knowledge that remains, or are we dealing here with a kind of discontinuity and gap? Indeed, it could be argued that Cartesian methodological doubt does not only and simply produce the certainty of being, but a split between knowing and being. So that at the extreme point of the cogito argument, we also get a glimpse at their mutual exclusion. The price of certainty is the discontinuity between one and the other, between knowing and being. Methodological doubt gradually and inexorably corners us, kind of places us in a position where we either are or know. There is no direct continuity between the two. When I know that I am no longer in the certainty of being, but already, we could say, in its after effect. Moreover, and to sharpen this point a little further, one might ask, is cogito ergo sum the ultimate proof of my being, or is it rather something like an escape into being from the plethora of different dubious thoughts? Descartes sets up his argument so that it points to a substance or being that has all these thoughts, even if they're false. He's therefore kind of suggesting a pre-existence of substance or being. But what if this substance, this something that appears as pure being, becomes pure being or substance only in the gesture of kind of ejecting itself out of these thoughts with which it is entangled, hence splitting with all knowledge or with knowledge as such? Can the Cartesian procedure not be described as a procedure in which I, so to speak, doubt myself out of all knowledge as possibly deceptive in order to be? We can add a further question to this. Does this mean that cogito is an escape from madness, as some have developed, for example, Michel Foucault? Or does it rather mean that cogito is the inaugural point of madness in the sense that it coincides in its structure with the inaugural point of the unconscious, its constitution? In which case it would be possible to argue that cogito is the unconscious. And actually Lacan came to read the cogito in this second way, particularly in the seminar 14, which is the famous seminar on the logic of fantasy, so far not translated in English yet. This is the seminar from 66-67, which reverses his previous reading from the seminar 11, the famous reading he develops there, in which cogito appears more like the obverse side of the unconscious. And this shift between the two readings is, I think, really, really interesting. So let us take a bit closer look at it. First, what remains the same in both readings is the claim that the structure of the cogito argument is the structure of what Lacan calls alienation, that is to say, the structure of an either-or. I either am or I think. I cannot have both, for their intersection is empty or impossible. Cogito as proof of being cannot be firmly established beyond the fleeting moment, this is the reading from the 11th seminar, beyond the fleeting moment of its utterance. It is true only at the moment when I say it, when I say cogito. Beyond that, I already have to rely on something else, namely the, let's say, the big other as guarantor of the continuity between these two moments of knowledge, and also as a guarantor of meaning, including the meaning in which I can be said to exist. And this, in turn, exposes the fact that the structure at stake here is indeed that of alienation, which has this further specificity that it's either or does not, in fact, allow us to choose one or the other, but implies a forced choice. I can only choose one of them. So it is not only that the intersection of being and thinking is empty except for the fleeting moment of saying cogito, I also have no other option but to choose thinking. Still, seminar 11, which Lacan identifies here with meaning. I can only choose meaning, the existence in the other, as my existence in the other, as the locus of signifiers. But with this choice, I lose the immediate certainty of my being. Certainty or knowledge of my being is now mediated by the other. The other is the locus, the structure that precedes me and determines that and what I am. Another way of putting this would be to say that I only exist in the other or in the symbolic and so on. We should also note that this reading resonates with Descartes' solution of the problem that he is, of course, well aware of, namely how to break out of the limited confines of my being as the only certain knowledge, how to bridge the gap between the knowledge of my being, the knowing that I am, and the true knowledge of what I am and what everything else is. And as you know very well, in Descartes, this gap can only be bridged by reintroducing an instance of a non-deceitful, infinite, and omniscient other God who guarantees the correctness of my knowing, even when I cannot derive it from 0 point of certainty at every particular moment. Otherwise, I would just need to think about it constantly. And as is also known, Descartes takes recourse at this point to the ontological proof of the existence of a non-deceiving God. So in order to establish a science or true knowledge of the external world, as well as of ourselves as res extensa, as bearers of sensible qualities, it is necessary to assume or prove the existence of God, who is not deceitful, who created eternal truths, and, as Descartes puts it, planted them in our souls as seeds. And of course, the philosophical debate continued with empiricism, which questioned the rationalist gesture of Descartes and culminated in Hume contesting the validity of the very notion of causality, which in turn woke Kant from his dogmatic slumber and led to the theory of the transcendental that excluded from the realm of knowledge the knowledge of things as they are in themselves. This story is well known, as is its aftermath, all the way to Quentin-Meillassoux and his reinterrogation of this development in After Finitude. However, and returning to the core of the cogito argument, we could say, and I think this is also Lacan's point, that all this development was made possible by the conversion already at work in Descartes of the split between being and knowledge into the split within knowledge, a split inherent to knowledge. And of course, it would seem that psychoanalysis is on the same train, let's say, train of thought, with its concept of the unconscious knowledge as the knowledge that doesn't know itself. But is this really so? Actually, if we read Lacan's seminar on the logic of fantasy, we get a very different and I would say much more interesting picture. In this seminar, Lacan cuts straight into the intestines of modern philosophy with a bold speculative claim. The split within knowledge is already a consequence, a repercussion of the split between being and knowing, implicit in cogito. Lacan now claims that if we look closer at the cogito argument, we see that the split or disjunction of thinking and being never really disappears, not even at the moment of uttering cogito ergo sum. Instead, Lacan now sees this split as the very ground of the constitution of the unconscious. How? Okay, there is a lot of mathematics and turning things around, but at the bottom, Lacan's new reading of the cogito is actually quite simple. He reverses the previous perspective completely and claims that what comes to the fore with the Cartesian cogito is in fact the choice of being as forced choice. A forced choice, moreover, that can only take place at the expense of thinking. Whereas before, as I mentioned, the forced choice was supposed to be that of meaning, thinking as meaning. As a matter of fact, Lacan now reads Descartes kind of more literally and simply reiterates his argument, albeit in a much stronger terms. And by stronger terms, I'm referring to how he now describes Descartes' procedure of putting in parentheses, evacuating all possible and possibly deceitful knowledge. He describes this process in the process of establishing certainty. Lacan describes this now as, I quote, throwing thought in the waste bin. We could also call it thinking the thoughts away, thinking oneself out of thinking anything. Descartes, he says, treats the cogito or thinking as garbage, as junk. This is all from the seminar 14. He throws it away in order to establish the certainty of being, or simply in order to establish being. Certainty of being is a moment at which thoughts remain outside, so to speak. The result of this new perspective is that cogito or thinking no longer appears as the opposite or the other side of the unconscious, but as the unconscious. Cartesian cogito describes the logical moment of the constitution of the unconscious. The constitution coincides not with repressing this or that thought, but kind of something falling out or being excluded, thrown away. And this difference is important because we are not on the level of psychology, but on the level of ontological constitution, on the level of being as established with certainty through an act that cuts, disentangles it from thoughts with which it appears. Being qua being is being amputated of thoughts with which it emerges. So Lacan now stages the cogito as the choice between not being and not thinking, in which we cannot but choose the not thinking in order to be. Being as such only appears as being out of this negativity, out of this cut. However, and this will be Lacan's, of course, crucial addition, this thing that is not there, this cut off part, so to say, does not disappear without leaving a trace, a gap, and this gap is actually the unconscious, properly speaking. The consistency of the unconscious is that of a gap. The unconscious is a gap in being, and this gap in being has a certain positive, albeit spectral, consistency. It is a non-being that is, so to say. It exists, and all these phrases. Unconscious is not simply what is not there. It is there precisely as a gap in being that affects, animates being, and its ways of being. It is not simply nothing, but it is also not a being. Important to acknowledge here, I think, are two things. First, as I already indicated, psychology is secondary in this disjunction of being and thinking. I can repress this or that thought or refuse to see it as my thought because it conflicts with my, let's say, psychological anchoring, but what we are discussing here is kind of more fundamental. It is a split constitutive of subjectivity, not a split induced by our subjectivity. Second, and even more importantly, it is not simply that from time to time unconscious thoughts force their entry from this other space, which in this case would be something like a container of all unconscious thoughts. No, the unconscious is primarily a thinking process, not a container. It is something in itself temporal, laboring, rather than just sitting there. So the unconscious thinks is how Lacan renders the gist of Freud's discovery. And this is precisely what this means. It is not stuck at some other place, it is an activity. And this unconscious, where often surprising thinking occurs, is where I am not. Lacan, the unconscious is the place where I am not, which is why things like not me, this is not me, I didn't say mean this, it was not me, constitutes the marker of the unconscious. And this comes, of course, particularly to the fore in the impersonal grammatical structure of fantasy, which articulates my being in terms of jouissance by eliminating me from the picture. Fantasy always takes the form of an objective description or a neutral sentence, like in the famous fantasy discussed by Freud, a child is being bitten. So let us now focus on why it is precisely in the seminar on the logic of fantasy that Lacan's come up with this new reading of Cogito. And this, I think, can take us a step further into this genuinely, I would say, speculative core of Lacan's argument. Of course, as all of you here know, fantasy is a very strong and precise concept in Lacanian theory. It has little to do with fantasy understood as imagination, imagining things and actions. Also, of course, fantasy is not the opposite of reality, nor is it the opposite of acting, of really doing it. Fantasy is a or the support of reality. It is not simply one with reality, it is what makes reality something we can actually relate to. To say, as Lacan does, that reality is phantasmatic does not suggest that it is unreal. The suggestion is philosophically much more ambitious and far-reaching, and I think it could actually be seen as no less than an alternative to what Kant calls the transcendental constitution of reality. So how does fantasy function as the constitutive support of our reality? As also mentioned already here several times, Lacan uses these two very significant terms when discussing fantasy: window and frame. Fantasy is what kind of frames the reality, posits it vis-à-vis the subject thinking of it. And this vis-à-vis or this correlation is the essence of fantasy, precisely. It is in this precise sense that fantasy is essentially the fantasy of the relation between being and thinking. Fantasy is what provides an opening onto reality. It is not simply what we see there through its window, but the window itself. This definition or description corresponds to what we call, let's say, a neutral or minimal state of fantasy, or simply fantasy as correlation, fantasy that we don't even recognize as fantasy, but as a kind of normal, ordinary state of things. And of course, then there is another level of fantasy, which comes closer to the more common usage of the term, fantasy as a specific scene, scenario, sentence that we are fascinated or captivated by. And the two levels are not unrelated. The second could in fact be seen as a kind of subjective symptom of the first. The fantasy within fantasy brings our attention to the otherwise neutral and invisible phantasmatic frame of ordinary reality. And Lacan introduces and discusses the connection of the two levels through the example already mentioned here several times of the Wolfman. Wolfman and this famous nightmare in which he dreamt that he was lying in bed when all of a sudden the window swung open, the window, and peering out he saw 6 or 7 wolves sitting in the tree outside his bedroom, their eyes fixed on him. And this dream, this pivotal fantasy, could be seen as precisely the other side of fantasy in its ordinary or everyday functioning as the frame of a reality. It kind of reintroduces the subject or something of the subject within the window that constitutes subject's, let's say, transcendental frame. And just a brief quote from Lacan, commenting on Wolfman, it is not only that the subject is fascinated by the sight of these wolves, it is that their fascinated gaze is the subject himself. So schematically put, we could formulate the configuration of fantasy as follows. There is something that falls out at the level of the constitution of the subject vis-à-vis the reality, constitution of the subject as correlative to reality. However, and differently from Kant's thesis, what falls out are not things such as they are in themselves, beyond our relation to them. What is at stake is rather that the subject gets constituted as subject through losing something of herself. And to use an image, the whole of this loss is the window, the frame through which the subject relates to the reality, posits herself in relation to it. Of course, this loss is not empirical, and in this sense, it is indeed transcendental. It is not part of subject's life experience. It can only be reconstructed retroactively, and it could be understood also in terms of what Freud called the primal repression, or Verdrängung, as kind of also constituting the ground of all other ordinary repressions. This is why, and I think this is really crucial, as Lacan puts it, although fantasy provides for everyone, chacun, the universal aspect, their window onto the real, this particularity is not the opposite of the universal, or it does not simply imply that everyone sees the reality in their own particular way, or that everyone has or lives in their own reality. The particularity or singularity refers, I would say, to the meaning that this original loss, which opens the access to reality as something that we can relate to, the meaning that this original loss obtains for every subject. It does not refer to reality as such or to some element of reality, although pathological distortions of the latter can certainly occur in view of the functioning of the set meaning attributed to the originally, let's say, missing piece of the subject. But this does not make the reality inaccessible in itself or in principle or a priori distorted. In other words, transcendental constitution here is not the constitution of reality, to put it too simply, but the constitution of the subject as correlative to this reality. Constitution of the subject involves something like pushing the subject from its immersion in reality to a position vis-à-vis reality. It also obviously involves the loss of some kind of immediacy, and this could be traced in Freud and his theory about how, reality, what is the reality test or reality, it's always find again reality. It's not, there is this idea that there is some immediacy that is lost here. So when constituted as subject of representation, let's say, the subject leaves something behind. More precisely and paradoxically, we would need to say that what the subject leaves behind is something that has no other substance but precisely that of a loss. Something is missing, the idea of the loss. The question or the emphasis is not on what the subject loses, but rather on the fact that subject first appears as having lost something. This loss and the appearance of the subject are one and the same event. There is no other way of conceiving this, which is exactly what makes this loss mythical. It is not part of the subject's experience because the subject only emerges with this loss. And speaking of the mirror stage, I think that there is a very nice formulation of this logic in one of Mladen Dular's text, when I quote very briefly, "When I recognize myself in the mirror, it is already too late. There is a split. I cannot recognize myself and at the same time be one with myself. With the recognition, I have already lost what one calls self-being." Okay, so from there, I would say, follows a certain dialectics rather than this kind of transcendental constitution. Reality is sustained and supported by the frame of fantasy, as far as the lack constituted by something falling out of reality, a bit of the subject falling out, remains in place as lack precisely, providing the frame of reality and its legibility, a bit like spacing between words make a text legible. The problem or crisis occurs if, as Lacan puts it, and we were discussing this yesterday, when le manque vient à manquer, the lack starts to lack, this lack that makes things legible, which induces anxiety. In the case of the Wolfman's dream, the object is not the wolves, but their fascinated gaze, indicated precisely the subject as this kind of lack in being. Wolfman sustains this object as part of fantasy, as fantasy within fantasy, window within a window, which precisely allows for its analysis. And I think, I'm going a bit quickly here perhaps, but I think that this is precisely the edge on which psychoanalysis operates. It does not simply operate by crashing the window of fantasy, trying to kind of just suffocate us in anxiety, but it also does not simply repudiate anxiety or try to eliminate or medicate it as quickly as possible. It points to anxiety as a paradoxical form of certainty, conceives of anxiety as a form of, these are quotes from Lacan, awful certainty, a signal of the real, a feeling that does not deceive. This is something that Bustian was talking about yesterday. Also, there is this very interesting formulation, which obviously relates to Descartes. Anxiety is the outside of doubt, le hors de doute. Not only hors doute, but le hors, the outside of doubt. So, but the certainty at stake here, however, is not the certainty of being, but rather the certainty, I would say, of thinking that goes on there where I am not. And in this sense, it is the certainty of non-being. So anxiety, as certainty, could be called an effect of the lack of being in this sense. And this is why anxiety plays an important role in psychoanalysis. It can be used as a point of orientation in analysis, and it needs to be administered in the right dosages, as also Lacan put it. In short, we need to work with it, through it, because the effect of non-being keeps us close to thinking, keeps us close to thinking, to knowing, and it kind of orientates us in this famous and unfamous movement of traversing the fantasy. So I would say that this movement is the movement of truth, of knowledge as truth. It ends by producing the missing piece, not uncovering or disentangling or revealing or whatever, actually literally producing the missing piece of the subject in its meaningless separate form, without eliminating it or declaring it a mere illusion or a mere projection or whatever. For even if it is a retroactive projection, it testifies precisely, this projection as such testifies to a split which is real and which can only be accessed by way of precisely traversing this phantasmatic framework and not in any kind of direct way. And I would suggest, I just have a couple of more minutes. I would like to suggest that the speculative propositions sketched out above constitute kind of Lacanian revolution in philosophy. Essentially for Lacan, this Lacanian move is the fact that subject is not simply mind or consciousness that contemplates the world, but is also part of this world. Something of the subject starts out there and remains out there when the frame of fantasy posits the subject vis-à-vis reality. This is what Lacan calls the she's split of the subject existing in two different places at the same time. And actually, when explaining the difference between his psychoanalytic perspective and the philosophical and particularly Kantian perspective involving transcendental categories and the distinction between phenomena and noumena, Lacan writes, this is in Seminar 11, for us, it is not this dialectic between the surface and that which is beyond that things are suspended. For our part, we set out from the fact that there is something already in nature that establishes a fracture, a bipartition, a splitting of the being to which the being accommodates itself. So this is a very interesting quote. It could be commented at some length. I would simply take out of it today this kind of example. I mean, Lacan's canonic example of this split is, of course, the split between the eye and the gaze. We were also discussing this on the first day. It concerns the idea that the point from which the subject looks at things as subject of representation, that is, subject looking onto the world through the window or frame of fantasy, and the point of the gaze are not the same. The gaze is the part of the subject that is out there. An object or object-like, objective or object-like stand-in for the gap left by something falling out at the point of the establishment of the correlation between subject and reality. So gaze is out there, and this is precisely the part of myself that I don't see, the blind spot, let's say, of my subjectivity. How does this then relate to cogito? Lacan's reading of Descartes in La logique du fantasme is not simply a criticism of Descartes. Rather, I think he recognizes in the cogito argument something like a sign or a fundamental non-correlation between being and thinking, of sign of correlation appearing as secondary, like secondary to their co-emergence as indistinguishable. The thinking subject, a subject of representation and of thoughts about the reality, relies on the logic of fantasy that correlates her thoughts to the world. And this correlation is based on the constitution of the unconscious as precisely expulsion of thoughts, throwing the thoughts in the waste bin, in the inaugural act of choosing being, that is, the subject emerging as a certainty of being, as I am. Yet the unconscious is not just a place, this thing outside, it is also a thinking that goes on and makes unexpected things happen. And when things happen, and they never fail to happen, I find myself in a repeated yet reversed version of this kind of inaugural forced choice, in which I could only choose being. I could not choose the unconscious. I couldn't choose the slip of the tongue, for example. What happens now is that the latter slip of the tongue, so to say, chooses me, in a way. This is Miller's formulation from his commenting on this. So what a slip of the tongue or a dream conveys is not some deeper or more reliable truth, but rather the certainty that thinking goes on even though I am not there as subject of this thinking, even if I am not where I think or if I think where I am not. And when this happens, psychoanalytic ear is there to notice it, to listen. And it can accompany me to the place where I am not, precisely, to the place of thinking. In other words, taking the unconscious into account can provide a way for the subject to kind of orient herself in reality in a way that is not confined to fantasy. It is what throws us out of joint with reality and gets then obfuscated in this kind of representation of the form of correlation. It is precisely this that can eventually also get us in the position to know something, that is, get it to the position of knowledge as truth. So I would conclude more or less that psychoanalysis in the Lacanian version proposes a different path from the one established after Descartes. And in the steps of Descartes, it proposes a path of, let's say, trusting the uncertain thoughts to produce the truth. That is, to produce knowledge as truth by their own means, as deceptive and deceiving as they are. And this then would be the Lacanian cogito, in which the coincidence of being and knowing is not the starting point, but can only be a result, the result of a movement. It can only be not only mediated, but arrived at. So as constitutive of subjectivity, this repression of non-being, the constitution of the unconscious, which coincides with the constitution of the unconscious, is not something that we can choose not to do at some kind of mythical point. Say, okay, I prefer not to be and to be. It's not. We have to. There is no proper choice there. It's a forced choice. Yet a choice that I can eventually reiterate precisely in this aftermath in a way that perhaps makes a difference. So this kind of dialectical relation, and I'm really concluding now, between fantasy and reality, I think also explains the definition of the end of analysis as traversing the fantasy. It is not about going beyond fantasy or eliminating, crashing the fantasy as frame of reality, but involves a movement and a shift within and of this frame. If reality is constituted through the frame of fantasy with something of the subject falling out of the picture, so to say, in this constitution, analysis starts and works with different asubjective occurrences of this missing piece that appear as surprises and as impediments of our normal lives and disturb our reality. So symptoms are so many forms and meanings in which the missing piece of the subject appears within subject reality. And if Lacan distinguishes between reality and the real, it is not to suggest that the real is some other higher or truer reality such as it is in itself, but precisely to make us think of the real as the split at the very heart of reality, its blind spot fracture, rather than something beyond reality. So the real, in a way, we could say, is the missing piece of our reality, and analysis works in the direction of producing this missing piece as real, yet essentially meaningless. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe there are questions, right? We're gonna take so to not to make it too long. Like we take like 3 questions, right? Okay. Emily, please. I'll bring you the mic.
I'm sort of still formulating my question, but as you know, the cogito is notoriously asexual, neuter. It's synonymous with sensus communis, common sense. And this is precisely why the cogito and Descartes have been criticized and also lauded. I mean, if you look at the 18th century Cartesian feminist treatises and so on. Previous attempts to sort of think through cogito against this interpretation with respect to structure and sexuation have relied on both accounts, right, from Seminar 11 and 14. And I was just wondering if your thinking shares an affinity with these accounts.
Sorry, I really have problems hearing you.
Sorry, I was wondering if your thinking about the cogito shares affinity with these accounts to try and think through the cogito with respect to sexuation.
Okay. Yeah, I think first thing that is kind of striking for me, at least in this second reading of the cogito, is that it completely displaces or dislocates this common debate about Descartes, which is about the split of the body and mind, or it is the story is that body is what is excluded, body is what goes into the waste bin, and we remain, or what remains is just the thinking. And what Lacan suggests here is really something very different. It is what goes to the waste bin is the thinking. And the real opposition perhaps is not between body and mind or body and thinking, but precisely between thinking in the sense of the unconscious, which would imply everything that you mentioned, including sexuation, precisely something that is there in the unconscious. I mean, that could be worked or mapped out in relationship to it. And let's say, thinking in this kind of just cognition or body or whatever. So it's not simply that the point of the body perhaps is not simply body in this imaginary sense, but it is something in the unconscious which has its own body, so to say, and which cannot be directly mapped onto the, let's say, simply biological body. And this shift, this kind of transposition of the, this kind of obvious, or the one that we are used to split, through which Descartes is usually read, is, I think, very productive, precisely also in its kind of surprising, counterintuitive aim, that it is not what, that it is thinking, actually, that disappears. I think this is really something kind of, But yeah, I think that from there on, this was a very kind of, let's say, abstract layout of this. But from there on, it would follow precisely that as the place of thinking, the whole question of sexuation comes into play precisely there. And the question of this other body, not other body, but precisely body as something different than simply body in its like biological function. Yeah.
I have a very, very short comment, basically. I mean, isn't the entire problem of Cartesian cogito precisely that Descartes always misses the bin of the what? That he misses the bin of that basket where you supposedly throw your being or your thinking. I mean, in principle, it's a failed attempt to think I'm not. Not anything else. I mean, does it somehow relate to what Lacan says? I mean, I have this slight trouble of thinking in the non-being because it's because I studied Descartes from more classical perspective. This dilemma of is it an intuition or deduction and so on. He doesn't manage to think himself off.
I think one way of perhaps of answering your question would be to say he misses the bin because bin is precisely not a bin, but it is this gap. So it's what I mean. It's not that he cannot, although he can actually even hit the bin, but what happens is that this bin or this thing thrown into the bin does not simply completely disappear. There is precisely something that the bin itself, so to say, which persists there, and which for Lacan, this waste basket, this waste bin is already part of thinking, or you know, so it's in this sense, but I think what you are getting at is this way in which Descartes is, I mean, all these reproaches to, like, even internal philosophical reproaches to the, let's say, gaps or perhaps leaps in his procedure that he kind of needs then to establish this, or is this what you are aiming at, no? That something of the thought remains, but I think this would be precisely the way of, I mean, this is how I see it, this constitution of the unconscious, not its disappearing. It's not that this is precisely something is constituted there through a certain gesture of, throwing it away. But so it is, again, a kind of ontological argument rather than, at this point, psychological. But I'm not sure if this answers your question.
Holden?
Okay, I think, Alenka, my question is kind of in two parts. Well, the first part is very basic, and the second part is potentially convoluted. But you briefly mentioned the pertinence of Freud's conception of reality testing. And given your thesis, quite compelling, that fantasy establishes a correlation between thinking and reality, which supports reality as such. Is the sort of inflection here that we're really only ever fantasy testing? And then if so, this is the convoluted part. And if so, does this result in a speculative philosophy that, although heavily modified and quite nuanced, is still nonetheless a sort of subjective idealism, not in which reality would be mind-dependent, but would be, I mean, it's something different than the conventional sense of subjective idealism?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, first I think, I mean, I had a part that I cut out, which deals precisely with this last part of Freud's essay on negation, where he ventures again in this kind of speculative hypothesis of how actually thought emerges out of this negation, which he kind of stages back in this mythical lustig that just kind of takes something in, and but this is something that is precisely immersed in reality and just like throwing things. There is the same kind of image, throwing things out and incorporating, injecting things in itself. And then he says, but at the moment then, when the subject emerges, we are no longer in the position of simply taking it in or out, or even determining whether it corresponds to this or that, but simply the task is to find it again, to see if it is still there or not. So it kind of moves this question of true or false knowledge to this kind of level. Can I find it again? Not what will I find, will correspond to this, but can I, and I think in this sense that this Freudian argument, again, extremely speculative and, yes, even is in a way reiterates or tries to tell the same story or the same structure, which is precisely this reality testing as all the objects. This is Freud's claim, which I think is really important. All the objects that we find are find-again objects. There is no object that one just finds for the first time. And this, for me, this speaks a little bit, goes in the same direction that I tried to sketch out from Lacan. Would this still be a kind of, did you say speculative idealism? What was your question, the last part of the question, the second part? Subjective idealism. Well, here I would say no, because I think it is precisely by focusing or refocusing this lost thing on the subject rather than on reality that I think it kind of, at least this would be, I guess, ideally Lacan saying, this kind of liberates the reality of this thing. So it's, it focuses on the subject, on the constitution of the subject, but not so as to put the subject in the center of the world, but precisely to remove the subject from the center of the world, because to remove this object as simply, what fascinates the subject there, because it is actually herself, himself. So it is a kind of, again, for my taste, is a kind of dialectical move that, although it seems to go into the opposite direction of what is now fashionable as this kind of just focus on the objectivity, on reality, but I think it does more to, let's say, liberate in the sense of kind of produce a certain kind of objectivity which precisely is not in this sense subjectively mediated or whatever, something like this.
I will allow another question with the number 4, but just because the questions were very well put and very shortly formulated. I mean, it's formulated in a short form. So, Boštjan, you are the last, right?
I'm the last. Yeah, I'll try to keep the same form of questions. One remark and then really maybe a superficial question.
No remarks.
but remarks doesn't need to be answered. So no, along the same lines, it's maybe very compatible with your argument. It might be extended to the way Lacan phrased the object A in, I think it's the first or second lesson of the Seminar 20, where he says precisely in comparison to Kant's distinction between phenomenon and noumenon, he says object A should not be think as a Kantian noumenon. That would be the wrong way to think the object weight, but rather, as he introduces the term, not par lettre, but it might resonate as para etre. So what stands beside being. So in a way, what is besides being, it's the object that's excluded from the picture, from reality, in order to reality to stand up as reality. And then a question is actually, at one point at the very beginning of the, you introduced the distinction between two different types of knowing. If I recall you, correct me if I'm wrong. So the knowledge itself is split in Descartes' argument. So in Lacan's reading of Descartes' argument, could you, maybe, that's association, speak also in parallel to this split into two different kinds of knowledge? Also, in Descartes' argument, speak about the split between two different types of kinds of being, in a sense that cogito, I mean, I'm relying here, for example, on Miller's reading of the cogito, that the point of cogito as an empty point differs from res cogitans, in which for example, Miller reads it as a kind of already an escape from this, well, I'm trying to read it as an anxious point of cogito. So from kind of escape from the void to the substance, that would be.
Okay, a few things. I will start at the end. I don't think that we should conceive this, I also use the term escape, but I don't think there is an anxiety that plays there. I don't think that this is, that we choose being because there is some kind of anxiety. Anxiety is actually, comes later as precisely the kind of the signal of returning of what was left outside and what could not but be left outside. So I don't think that we should like psychologize this and say, okay, we are so anxious, so we choose this because we, it is the question of, there is the question of certainty and these uncertain thoughts that are, everything that we can say about them is that they are uncertain in a way, if certainty is, let's say, what we are pursuing here. But very briefly, first, I think what you say about para being that this, I mean, in my memory, this is something that Lacan says in relationship to unconscious, not so much to the object. Object, I don't know, perhaps I am mistaken. But I think object, I see this concept, I see it precisely as Lacan's invention, introduction into the reality of another kind of objectivity, of another object, which is precisely the stand-in for this gap, for this lack. That, so, and this is, but it is kind of introducing, I mean, he really shows how there is a new object that is part of reality, or of objective reality, because of this constitution. So it's not simply the subject becomes added to this, it is also, there is a new object that emerges because subject was constituted in this way. Yeah, for the two kinds of, I mean, I don't think there, I was talking about split in knowledge. Let's say it could be deceitful knowledge or non-deceitful knowledge, knowledge about primal certainty, and then other knowledge. It's really this split of knowledge being already secondary or kind of symptom of this other split which is repressed, this split between being and knowledge. So the idea was that this, the knowledge returns in this dual form precisely because this split is or cannot but be kind of originally repressed or something like this. But okay.
Okay, thank you, Alenka. This was great. We will